Greetings everyone, and welcome to another Halloween horror movie review. Today we continue our journey through the Universal Monsters saga with 1939's Son of Frankenstein, starring Basil Rathbone, who many of you may remember as Sherlock Holmes, as Wolf Frankenstein, the son of Dr. Henry Frankenstein of the first two films. Boris Karloff returns as the monster, and this time around we also have Bela Lugosi as Igor, what many fans consider to be one of his all-time great characters, and rightly so. He's absolutely fantastic in this. So, let's talk about it. The Son of Frankenstein, today on the Multimedia Chronicles. Welcome back. So, Son of Frankenstein was kind of notable in the history of Universal Monsters because they hadn't done much in the way of horror films for the past couple of years, and both Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi found things to be a little quiet on the job front as a result. So, of course, that's where they'd both made their big claims to fame. So apparently it was something to do with Britain having an embargo on horror films since 1936 and other reasons, essentially. They just weren't seen as being particularly profitable, I guess. But then there was a re-release. A double bill of shocks and terror that the theaters dared the viewers to see together. Dracula and Frankenstein being released as a big double bill event. The theaters went crazy for it. It ran for weeks. It sold tickets like gangbusters. It was a huge success. A lot of people went. They made piles of money. And Universal took notice of that. And it's like, oh, so people like these monster movies. Maybe we should make some more of them. So in 1939, they released Son of Frankenstein. And lo and behold, it was a huge hit. So for about the next decade or so, Universal continued to put out monster movies on a fairly regular basis. So Son of Frankenstein opens with the arrival of Wolf Frankenstein, his lovely wife Elsa, and his young son Peter, arriving by train to the town of Frankenstein. Yes, the actual town in this is called Frankenstein. So one gets the impression that Henry Frankenstein was quite a bigwig in the town there for quite some time. I mean, the whole town was named after him. But the townspeople are not very welcoming of Wolf and his family. Their memories are very long, and they remember what his father had done with the creation of the monster, all the chaos and murders that happened, and they really don't want anyone from that family coming back to their town after they've known peace for so long. So they met with a lot of suspicion and hostility and just generally not made to feel very welcome. Now, Wolf has no intention of continuing his father's work, even though he is himself a scientist and, has a scientific curiosity in what his father had done, but has no intention of repeating the same mistakes his father made. So he's trying to convince not only the townspeople of this when they arrive, but in particular trying to convince Inspector Krogh, played by the wonderful Lionel Atwill. Now, Krogh is very concerned that there's now a Frankenstein living in the castle once again, and says that he's keeping an eye on him and his family to offer protection, because tempers are hot in the town, and he wants to make sure that nobody goes and does anything stupid and injures Wolf or his family. But also, he wants to keep an eye on Wolf, of course, and make sure that he's not up to his father's old tricks. Meanwhile, Igor, played by Bela Lugosi, has been living in the castle all of this time, and has become something of a spooky figure that scares children and whatnot. Now, interesting to note, of course, everyone will be familiar with the fact that Igor has become synonymous with being Dr. Frankenstein's assistant in the sort of public perception of Frankenstein lore. But as we talked about in the previous two reviews, he never had an assistant named Igor. In fact, in the original book, He never had an assistant at all. He worked alone. In the 1931 movie, his assistant was named Fritz, played by the wonderful Dwight Fry. And the sort of stereotypical trope of it is that Igor is the hunchbacked assistant. Well, Fritz had a hunchback, if I recall correctly. Igor, however, does not. He actually has a broken neck, so he's constantly got his head like this, and you can see a wonderful prosthetic appliance by Jack Pierce, the bones pushing through the skin on one side of his neck. See, what had happened was Igor had been hanged because he was accused of stealing bodies. In fact, there's a wonderful scene where Wolf meets Igor for the first time. He's seen Igor lurking around in the castle, and Igor actually tries to kill him because he thought he was there to kill him. And they're having a conversation, and he says, so why did they hang you? And Igor just says, I was stealing bodies. They said. I mean, like, that's what they claimed I was doing. So I can see where everything kind of got mishmashed together in the public memory, the public consciousness, because the implication in Son of Frankenstein is that Igor was the doctor's assistant and he was helping him to steal bodies for his experiments. But of course that contradicts what we've seen in the previous movies. But that said, although this is technically a direct continuation of the previous two movies, they have changed quite a few things in this one. The old lab in this looks nothing like any of the labs we'd seen in the previous movies. The castle looks completely different. I have to say, though, the direction they went in with the design is really cool and interesting. It almost feels like German Expressionism and film noir with like huge, stark shadows on the walls, massive, cavernous rooms. For example, when Wolf and his wife Elsa are having dinner, they're at this tiny little table with a couple of chairs around it in this cavernous room. And there's a big staircase leading upstairs, and there's a little landing that overlooks the table. But it's really quite striking set design, I have to say. Very different from what we've seen before, but it's obvious that director Roland V. Lee was looking to put his own stamp on things, because this was the first of the Frankenstein movies not directed by James Whale, and James Whale very much had his own distinct kind of gothic style to them that he put into the first two. So I think in this case, Roland V. Lee wanted to go in a different direction to make it more distinctively his movie, as it were. So it is soon discovered that, contrary to popular belief, the monster is in fact not dead after the events of the previous film. Igor informs Wolf that he in fact rescued the monster from the wreckage of the old lab, and now, while the monster is alive, he's in a coma, so he's very unresponsive and such, but Igor refers to him as his friend. So again, we get the impression that they're implying that Igor's always been around, that he's always been there, that he knew the monster before when he was alive and well and conscious, and that they established a friendship, which is interesting because the events of the first movie, if we're to just kind of transpose Igor with Fritz was a complete jerk to the monster and was in fact tormenting, torturing, and harassing the monster at every opportunity, ultimately resulting in the monster killing him. So I don't know, you kind of have to take things as they are as far as continuity goes. And you'll notice this throughout the Universal Monster movies. The ones that do have direct sequels and continuity to them are not always 100% consistent with each other, but we'll talk about those as we go through them. So Wolf gets a box from the local burgomaster which contains all of his father's scientific notes. And when he meets Igor and Igor shows him the monster, Igor asks him, well, you're a Frankenstein. Surely you can help my friend and revive him and, bring him back to his old self. And this engages Wolf's scientific curiosity. And of course, he's heard all the stories about his father's work and can't help himself. He has to revive the monster just to see, to study, to understand what it was that his father had discovered, and feels that he'll be able to do so in a way that the monster won't be dangerous. So, with Igor's assistance, he proceeds to go through his father's notes and try to revive the monster. Needless to say, he's successful. But then, shortly after reviving the monster, Wolf is sure that he's got the monster contained down in the lab and that he's not going to go wandering about. But there are secret passages in this old castle that he doesn't know about, that the monster does know about. And he starts hearing from Peter, his son, about a giant that he's seen walking around. A giant that has come to visit him in his room at night. And that he's a friendly giant, that they just play together a little bit and then he goes off. Now, Inspector Krogh catches wind of these stories of Peter's, and he's very concerned, because one of the things he talks about with Wolf is his previous encounters with the monster. Now, Inspector Krogh actually has a false arm, and he tells Wolf about what happened, that when he was a young boy, about Peter's age, the monster grabbed hold of his arm and tore it out by the root. So literally ripped off his arm when he was a boy. In fact, there's a wonderful scene where Peter is just innocently talking about his giant friend and saying how, yeah, he came to my room and he grabbed me by the arm. And Krogh is listening and he just flinches and goes to hold his own arm. Like it instantly triggered that horrible traumatic memory for him. And he begins to suspect there's something going on here that is not right. Wolf isn't being 100% honest with him. So several murders take place, and there's something very suspicious about the murders, because a connection that is made between those murders is that they are all the jurors that convicted Igor and sentenced him to hang. So what had happened was he had been sentenced to hang, and he survived. He was pronounced dead, and they cut him down, and he survived. So essentially, Igor is getting his revenge. So he wanted the Wolf to revive the monster so he could have his revenge. So Wolf comes to realize this and knows that he has to stop Igor. Meanwhile, the villagers are convinced that it's the work of the monster, and there's only one person that could have revived the monster or created a new monster. They don't know if it's the same one. And that's Dr. Frankenstein. So they form the obligatory angry mob and head off to take care of Frankenstein. Meanwhile, Krogh shows up to protect him, saying, the villagers are really angry about the murders and they suspect that you're involved and I'm here to protect you. So they go to the drawing room and Frankenstein is quite distraught because he knows what's going on. He's put the pieces of the puzzle together. He knows he has to stop Igor and stop the monster. Only he can do it. But he can't tell anybody about it because he doesn't want to be blamed for everything. He knows that technically speaking, it was Igor responsible for the murders because he can control the monster, but at the same time he feels responsible because, of course, he revived the monster in the first place. There's a wonderful tense scene where he and Krogh are in the drawing room and just kind of passing the time to see what they're going to do. So they're waiting in the drawing room and they're just kind of playing darts to pass the time. And it's a very tense conversation. Krogh knows there's something up. He's just waiting for Wolf to admit it. They're playing darts together. And I have to say, Basil Rathbone must have been one heck of a darts player because there's a scene where he's actually talking to Krogh. So he's talking to Krogh. The dartboard is over here. He's looking at Krogh and throwing darts at the dartboard. The first one he throws is almost a bullseye. The second one he throws is a bullseye. And then the remainder of them are just kind of all over the board. But I couldn't believe that. Like, one almost bullseye and a dead-on bullseye without even looking at the board. And then Krogh goes to have his turn, jabs all the darts into his false arm, and then throws one and it almost misses the board. So, of course, the false arm is the right arm. So I'm guessing Lionel Atwill probably wasn't left-handed. I'm sure he must have been a better dart player than that, but he was, of course, throwing with his left hand. So, yeah. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that Igor is largely considered to be one of Bela Lugosi's all-time great characters and all-time great performances, and it's easy to see why. I mean, he is such a fun character in this. I mean, he's just the most scheming, conniving, but somehow likable bad guy character. There's just something strangely endearing about him, where he essentially was wronged in a way from a certain perspective, and is simply looking for justice, taking revenge. Now, obviously, taking it too far, the years alone in the castle have obviously driven him a little nuts, but he's just such a fun character. There's a wonderful scene where he goes to talk to all the leaders of the town. He's just having so much fun because they somehow suspect that he's involved in what's going on, but they can't prove it. And he's just having so much fun messing with them, knowing that they can't prove a damn thing. And at one point, he leans over and is like, he like coughs right on one of the guys, and he's like, "You just spit all over me." It's like, I'm sorry, I have bone in throat," and which of course is referring to the bone jutting out of his neck. But it's obvious that that Bela had so much fun with this. Now, this was a point in Bela Lugosi's career where things had hit a bit of a slump, and I need to mention this. Apparently, Universal was trying to lowball him a little bit, only giving him $500 a week, which was not a lot for a big actor like him. Boris Karloff, I'm not sure what he was getting paid, but he was definitely getting paid more. He was considered to have more marquee value at the time. So Roland V. Lee, the director, was appalled by how Universal was treating him, and he loved Bela Lugosi. He thought he was a great actor and deserved way better treatment than what he was getting. So the script they used was actually unfinished at the time that they started shooting. So the director was making a lot of modifications and changes as they were going, and making sure that Bela had a lot more to do. Apparently he had a very minimal presence, like the character of Igor had a very minimal presence in the original version of the script, but it was the director, Roland V. Lee, that made Igor such a central part of the story, because just through luck, I guess, they had the freedom to make changes as they were going. So he kept expanding the role to make sure that Bela Lugosi got as much time as he could possibly give him on screen, and thus make sure that he got paid well. So apparently Bela was just beside himself with gratefulness for that, because it's like, wow, thank you so much for that. Like, you have no idea how much I really needed this this job and this opportunity. And the end result is, we as viewers 80 years later are treated to this wonderful, incredibly entertaining performance, and it wasn't just that he was doing it because he needed the work. I mean, he really was the consummate professional through and through, and he put everything into this performance and really just gives it his all, and he's an absolute joy to watch. So and I mean, Lionel Atwill as well is fantastic as Krog, and like perfectly quietly menacing and incredibly entertaining. He's the inspiration for the character of the inspector that Kenneth Mars played in Young Frankenstein. You'll see very direct comparisons between the two. In fact, Young Frankenstein is probably more based on Son of Frankenstein than anything else. I'll say this, by the way, just while I'm on the subject. The next time you watch Young Frankenstein, before you watch it, watch the first 3 Universal Frankenstein movies. Trust me, you'll get so much more out of Young Frankenstein, in that you'll see all the connections and all the specific things that they're referencing and making fun of, and it makes it even better than it already is. When you're actually cognizant of those connections and see, and then you see just what a loving homage it is to the classics, as well as being a spot-on parody of them. It's really shows just how brilliant a film Young Frankenstein is. So, Son of Frankenstein was the most direct inspiration for that. So I have to mention, of course, Boris Karloff as the monster once again. His final performance as the monster. He would appear in some other Frankenstein films, but not as the monster, which is interesting. Now, again, speaking of continuity, there's a couple of little head scratchers here. First off, the clothes that he appears in this, he has the furry outfit, are different from what we saw him in in the previous one, but that's fine. You can kind of pass that off. Well, Igor gave him a change of clothes because the other clothes were probably wrecked in the explosion of the lab. Fair enough. We can let that one go. But the other thing that was strange was the fact that in Bride of Frankenstein, the monster began to learn how to speak. It was a pretty significant scene, for example, in Bride of Frankenstein, where he's with the blind man, and the blind man's teaching him different words and phrases and such. But in this one, he's mute again. He just kind of growls and roars and screams and stuff like that. That may have been the influence of Boris Karloff, actually, because I remember reading that he didn't feel that the monster should speak in these, even though in the original novel, of course, the monster is quite verbose and quite eloquent in how he speaks. For this version of Frankenstein, Boris Karloff felt it diminished the character, and he preferred to play it mute and just kind of have the monster communicate through his mannerisms and body language and facial expressions and things like that. And I have to say, I mean, testament to Boris Karloff's skill as an actor, he conveys so much through his physical performance. And this really is a good send-off for his interpretation of the monster. There's two scenes in particular which really stand out for me. There's one where he's in the lab with Wolf, and he sees himself in the mirror. Now, the monster did see himself briefly in the first Frankenstein movie, where he caught his reflection in a pond. But the implication here is that he didn't make the connection that that was him. And he just kind of swatted at the water and made the reflection go away through the ripples. In this one, however, he sees his reflection in the mirror, and at first he thinks it startles him, and he doesn't know how to react. But then he moves his hand a little bit, and then realizes that it's him, and he goes and looks. And this is the first time he's properly seen himself and knows what he looks like. And he looks, and he just becomes crestfallen and sees how hideous he is. And he goes and looks over at the doctor, who's Basil Rathbone, very handsome fellow, and pulls him over. And he looks at him, and he looks at himself in the mirror, and his shoulders just kind of slump. He just goes, why can't I look like this? There's so much conveyed in that scene, and there's a moment where he does. Remember, I talked about in the previous ones how he does that thing where he's kind of pleading, which he does so well. It's just so full of desperation and pathos, like, please help me. So he does that to Wolf, and then he just kind of like realizes there's nothing he can do. Like, there's so much that goes on in that moment that Boris conveys entirely through his mannerisms and his body language, and Basil Rathbone just stands and watches. It's all Boris in that scene, and it's absolutely beautiful and heartbreaking to see the monster in this moment where he has this revelation about himself, and it's beautifully done by Boris. The other moment is towards the end of the film, where in the climax, Igor is shot and apparently dead, and the monster finds his body and sees that he's dead, and just lets out this scream of the purest, most unfiltered anguish. Now, apparently Universal was so impressed with that scream that they added it to their sound library and used it in a lot of other, even non-monster movies. But, yeah, I mean, Boris was an absolutely phenomenal actor. And he had a beautiful speaking voice, too. I mean, I'm sure you've seen any number of films in which he had a speaking role, or how about How the Grinch Stole Christmas, where he narrates How the Grinch Stole Christmas, and it's fantastic. But his performance as the monster is truly one of the all-time great horror movie performances, like monster performances, and conveyed so much with hardly uttering a word. So after seeing his friend Igor dead, and knowing that it was Wolf who killed him, again, testament to the skill of Boris as an actor, he has this moment where he's kind of trashing the lab and throwing things around, and he picks up this book and he's about to throw it, and he looks at the book, and what it is it's a book of fairy tales. And it's a book of fairy tales that Peter, the little boy, had given him during one of his nighttime visits. And the monster looks at the book and just crumples it up and throws it to the ground and has this evil smirk on his face. And again, without conveying a word, you know exactly what the monster's thinking. You killed my friend, I'll kill your son. Now that was interesting to me because I saw it as a little nod to the original book, where there's a pretty important moment where the monster kills William, Victor Frankenstein's brother, and he does so to give Frankenstein a taste of the anguish that he feels. So it was interesting to me that they did that in this movie because it was kind of like a little nod to that from the book. Of course, by this point, the movies have drifted so far from the source material, but it's nice to see those little moments that those familiar with the book will pick up on. So as I said, Son of Frankenstein was a huge hit and was largely responsible for giving us the decade or so of monster movies that followed. Just a little side note, there was a comic book put out of Universal movie-based comics, and Son of Frankenstein was one of them. Yeah, take a look at that. So, possibly one of the earliest comic book adaptations of a movie, and done in this interesting style of having actual colorized stills from the movie. And it essentially gives you the whole story, condensed down to about 8 pages. So, yeah, pretty cool. A couple of other little mentions or nods that I found interesting. There's a scene early in the film where Wolf is talking to his wife about how the villagers are being so unpleasant to them and how the name of his family has been sullied because of the supposed misconceptions about the work that his father had been doing. He's talking about that, and he mentions that, some people even associate the name Frankenstein with the monster. He doesn't quite finish what he's saying, but you know what he's referring to. The fact that everybody says Frankenstein, meaning the monster. But of course, Frankenstein was the creator, not the monster. But a lot of people do like to add to that and says, yes, but in the story, Frankenstein is the true monster. I think that's what we call subtext. Another one is when he's examining the monster for the first time, and he points out that the bolts in the neck are actually electrodes, which is what the intention always was, that they were electrodes because, of course, it's electricity that brings the monster to life. However, interesting to note, it isn't until this movie that we actually see any wires hooked up to them. We'd never seen any wires hooked up to those electrodes before, but in this one we actually do. And in a kind of semi-related side note to that, the electrodes, of course, being part of Jack Pierce's makeup design, and Jack Pierce's makeup being featured quite prominently throughout this film, not only for the monster, but also for Igor. Jack Pierce oddly gets no on-screen credit in Son of Frankenstein. Gee, thanks, guys. No appreciation or anything. He only designed, the most iconic and immediately recognizable monster makeup in history and major movies legends. Not like it's worth mentioning him by name or anything, I guess. So there would be one more solo Frankenstein movie before they went on to the Monster Mash trilogy, and that was Ghost of Frankenstein, which is actually a direct sequel to Son of Frankenstein. But we'll talk about that one another time. So that about wraps it up for this review. If you'd like to add the Frankenstein Legacy Collection, which has every single Universal Monsters Frankenstein movie from Frankenstein all the way up to Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, includes the full Monster Mash trilogy and all the Frankenstein sequels that preceded it. I will include an Amazon link in the description for you. I've been doing that for all the Universal Monsters ones, so I'll include a link for this as well as the Universal Monsters 30 movie collection if you'd just like to get the whole darn thing in one go. So, yeah, thank you very much for your support. Alrighty, well, that is it from me to you for now. So thank you very much for watching. Big thanks to my Patreon sponsors. Be sure to catch me on Twitch. I stream just about every day. And I'll see you next time. Until then, sayonara. The third of the Frankenstein films, and a very direct sequel to the first two. Now, yeah. Blah, blah, blah. Welcome back. So, the story opens some years after the events of The Bride of Frankenstein. I don't think it's actually specified exactly how many years it's been, but we assume it's been at least 20, maybe 25, just judging from the fact that his son is an adult man, a male, man's man, manly men doing manly things of manness. Now you're a man, a Frankenstein man. So, Son of Frankenstein. So, they did Son of Frankenstein, and... So, they did Son of Frankenstein, and it was a huge hit. For the next decade or so, they would continue to churn out monster movies for the next decade or so. So in 1939, they released Son of Frankenstein with some people in it. So I was going to say, do the welcome back. And just to play it safe, put some star power behind it, putting in Basil Rathbone, bringing back Boris Karloff as the monster, putting Bela Lugosi in it, and even having Lionel Atwill as Krog, the police inspector who's constantly hounding Wolf Frankenstein and making sure he's up to no good. For about the next decade, Universal continued to put out monster movies, sometimes several per year, until eventually interest died down and they just said, fuck it, no more monster movies. Fuck it. It's well documented, that's what they said. They had a big board meeting and a whiteboard, and all that was written on the whiteboard was, fuck it, no more monster movies. So they all ate their coffee and donuts and went home. So there would be one more solo Frankenstein movie. Again, a full-on sequel. Yeah. So there would be one more Yeah. Oh. Is that thing I keep hearing about called subtext? So, that about wraps it up. Oh my god, 46 minutes.